Hello and welcome to everyone from the wider Maryland law community. Welcome back after the holiday break. I'm Peter Danchin, Associate Dean for Research. This, of course, is our first anchor event for the spring, which, as in the fall, is continuing our series of conversations focused on issues of racial and social injustice and inequality, and how we as lawyers and future lawyers have a role to play in speaking out against injustice and working to confront systemic racism. Just while people have their calendars at hand, our next anchor event in this series will be in 2 weeks on January 25th. So please put that in your calendars. We'll be joined by Professor Charles Mills, who's a distinguished political theorist from the Graduate Center at CUNY, who will be speaking about theorizing racial justice, which should be a terrific event. But today, of course, I think we're all grappling and really struggling to come to terms with the events of recent days in the nation's capital. And as the dean indicated in his email to students, the events of the last few days in Washington, of course, raise many, many issues, not the least of which is the questions surrounding both law enforcement presence and response and some of the disparate situation we see on these questions, and which we're going to start to explore a little bit today. So the subject for today's anchor event is a recently published book, I Got a Monster: The Rise and Fall of America's Most Corrupt Police Squad, which, as the email indicated, tells really the dramatic inside story of the Gun Task Trace Force, which terrorized Baltimore City for half a decade. And what I'm going to do at this stage is hand over to my colleague, Professor Michael Pennard, who's the co-director of our clinical law program, of course. And Michael is going to both moderate today's discussion, as well as introduce our two speakers and the authors of this fantastic book. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you. And certainly it's my honor to introduce our two speakers, and also just to thank them for taking the time out of their hectic schedules to talk about some of these issues with us. So first, Brandon Soderberg is a reporter whose work has appeared in many news publications, including the New York Times, Vice, and the Village Voice. He's the news editor and co-founder of the Baltimore Beat. He was the editor-in-chief of the Baltimore City paper, as well as a contributing writer with Spin Magazine, and he's the co-founder of the Baltimore Institute for Nonprofit Journalism. Bernard Woods is a freelance writer. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, as well as Baltimore-based outlets such as the Baltimore Beat, the Real News Network, and the City Paper, and they both live here in Baltimore. And as Dean Danchin mentioned, they've written this incredibly powerful and must-written book. I don't know with my background if you can see the book, but I do. I mean, I'm holding it up in front of me at this point, but I think my background may be fading it out. However, there's a website that we put in the chat. There it is. Bernard put it in. Bernard has the book up. There's also a link to the book and what the book's about in the chat. And this is really a must-read book. Particularly if you live in Baltimore, if you go to school in Baltimore, if you're connected in Baltimore in any way, this truly is a must-read book. And as Dean Danchin said, the book tells the story of the Gun Trace Task Force and some of the individuals who are the victims of their abusive crimes. This event was originally scheduled for November 9th, which is the Monday following the presidential election. And we decided to postpone the event because we were consumed with the beginning of the election's aftermath. And so we imagined that you all were as well, and we thought this event would be best held later. And so here we are today. And now we are consumed with a different part of the election's aftermath, the insurrection, the violence, and the mayhem at the US Capitol last Wednesday. That insurrection actually makes this book even more important, even more vital. It has sharpened the focus of issues and realities that all of us must confront And this insurrection was about many things, right, including anger, hatred, racism, anti-Semitism, the rule of law, privilege, and narrative. But it was also about policing, particularly racialized policing. And I cannot think of a more glaring example of how race is a key driver of policing in this country. And that's what we will talk about a bit today. So we will talk about this book in this context. We will juxtapose some of the facets of policing in Baltimore with what happened outside and inside the Capitol last week. We'll talk for approximately 35 to 40 minutes. We'll then open it up for questions and observations. So please put your questions and observations in the chat. All right, so Baynard and Brandon, I want us to start with the GTTF and the title of the book. So what was the GTTF? And please explain the meaning of the book title, particularly the word monster.
You want to start, Brandon?
Yeah, sure, I'll start. Yeah, so the Gun Trace Task Force, as I imagine everyone has some sense of what they were a plainclothes police squad in Baltimore City that were robbing people, dealing drugs, stealing drugs. Now we have allegations of planted evidence. We also have massive overtime fraud and just routine and constant constitutional violations. That's the sort of, quick version of it. It's basically 7 initial officers. Since then, about 8 or 9 have also been connected to it and indicted as well on a federal level. And this all happened in 2017. Our book really covers the last year or so of these officers on the streets when they were all working together as a big super group of dirty cops that were, in some ways, we think, and there's certainly some evidence and wiretap information that shows this, that they kind of knew the end was near. Did they think the end was near, that they were going to all get indicted? No, but they kind of had a sense that they needed to have one last run at really robbing people and lining their pockets on behalf by robbing Baltimore citizens. As our book really looks at the last year and also cross-cuts and investigates the people that they victimized and the defense attorneys that had been kind of yelling about this for a really long time. So that's kind of a big picture there. Boehner, maybe you want to pick it up there with Monster and anything else I didn't say we should say.
Sure. So yeah, like Brandon said, this was a super group that came together that had all been committing crimes separately for a long time before the group that was indicted. And that's caused a lot of confusion because, how long they were terrorizing the city and stuff. People wanted to look at the history of the Gun Trace Task Force as if it was just those initials GTTF that were somehow the problem, rather than plainclothes policing in Baltimore in general. And Wayne Jenkins, the mastermind of the task force that was brought down, had been in a wide variety of plainclothes squads he joined the Baltimore Police Department in 2003, and he was in, they called it OCD, the Organized Crime Division, then VCID and VCIS, the Violent Crimes Impact Division, Violent Crimes Impact Section. Every time there'd be another scandal, they would change the name, change the initials, but the same people would keep moving through. Wayne Jenkins started robbing big time drug dealers. He regularly would take drugs off people that he stopped in the street in unconstitutional searches, but he started using both federal and state intelligence when a war room came together after the protests following the death of Freddie Gray. And he started using all of this intelligence to rob the biggest drug dealers he could find. And when he found one that was particularly big, he would call up his co-conspirators and say, "I got a monster." So he wasn't talking in moral terms. He was talking in monster truck terms, monster fish terms. This is a big one. And they would then set about finding a way to stop the person, get the person's keys, get into their house for a sneak and peek, find out what was in there that they could steal, and then they'd go write a warrant. And then they'd come back in with a lot of the drugs or money already gone.
And so the crimes that these former officers committed were beyond brazen. The tactics that they used to surveil, to deceive, to victimize and abuse were both imaginable and, quite frankly, unimaginable, right? And they victimized a wide swath, of people. And just a couple of examples that you talk about in the book, Jenkins, who chases a gentleman by the name of Umar Burley, and Burley then crashes his car and kills the driver of another car. And then Jenkins then calls a sergeant to plant heroin on Burley. Right? He actually had no reason to chase Burley. Jenkins chasing a person on foot and then hurting him, and then calling another sergeant to plant a BB gun on that person for other officers to find. Another sergeant by the name of Rayhan, who put a track on someone's car and then dressed like a mailman to sneak into that person's house and to steal, right? So, there's a wide variety of crimes that they committed, a wide variety of individuals and families and communities who they abused. And so my question is this: a lot of times when we talk about issues of policing and particular officers who essentially have gone rogue, we talk about it in the context of quote unquote bad apples. And so is this a book about bad apples, or are there connections between the GTTF and policing more generally?
I mean, the way that Baynard and I really see it is we always try to stress that I think these officers were exceptionally bad. I think that we need to kind of acknowledge that, but that what they were doing was the very logical extension of this kind of plainclothes warlike policing. It's all of these terms are getting so upside down and mixed up because we have sort of a attempted fascist takeover of our country last week. But, we really see these guys as a counterinsurgency. And I think that's another way to see what happened on last week was as a counterinsurgency. These were insurgents, but they are trying to maintain power and keep a fascist in office. And so we kind of see that counterinsurgent part is important because that is conventionally how plainclothes policing is working. It's disrupt and cause chaos and, terrorize parts of the city. That is partially the goal of plainclothes policing. And so these officers kind of took those warlike tactics and logic and training just a little further. And so you start to not see these people that you're arresting or investigating or supposed to be investigating as people, but as sort of enemies and opponents. It makes sense that it makes it increasingly easy to rob from them and violate their rights in really egregious ways that we could throw up 20 more examples of that. And so I think that's where it is that you have this when you have decades of unaccountable policing, where every time something similar to this happens, we throw out this bad apples defense rather than realize this is systemic and bigger than just a few cops. I think you're going to see that now with also identifying police officers and former police officers who were at the Capitol last week as part of the counterinsurgency. You'll see this as this is an exception, but there's been FBI evidence of white supremacy within the police department. I hesitate to say infiltrating because I think we need to also understand that policing is kind of inherently a white supremacist function. That's what it does. But that's kind of the main thing is I think we need to stress that were most Baltimore police officers doing this? Certainly not. But are they adjacent to this kind of criminality and this corruption? I think so.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I want to, picking up that term systemic, and I want to pick up from there, and particularly as it relates to last week's insurrection at the Capitol. So many have stated the absolute fact that had the insurgents who stormed the Capitol, scaled the walls, busted through the perimeter, punched through windows, put officers and members of Congress in peril, killed one officer, attacked other officers, and tore apart and desecrated the Capitol. Had they been Black, we would have seen a whole different situation. Officers would have beaten, they would have arrested immediately, and they would have killed Black people last week, right? Those who would have been charged would be wallowing in pretrial detention right now. I believe about 23 of the insurgents from last week have been released on their own recognizance and allowed to go back to their home state. So the simpler fact, though, is that it actually wouldn't have happened in the first place. There would have been scores of law enforcement personnel present from the White House to the Capitol. Military vehicles would have been parked along the entire route. People would not have been able to even breach the perimeter if they had wanted to do so. There will have been no need to call additional law enforcement departments to the scene after the insurgents broke into the Capitol, these departments would have already been there. And we know this because we have seen and we've experienced how racial justice protests have been policed, including in DC last summer. And we also know it because of the even longer history of police violence inflicted on Black people during protests and marches. And so there's a stark contrast between, quite frankly, how white people are policed and how Black and brown people are policed. And for me, last week, I saw value ascribed to the lives and bodies of the insurrectionists. And so in stark contrast, though, I want you to talk about how hyper-policing focused on Baltimore's Black residents and neighborhoods fed into the GTTF's crimes.
Yeah, and let me make a quick connection too between,
Sure.
policing and whiteness seem to function by exactly the same logic. So what we saw GTTF doing and what we see Baltimore police doing in general isn't very different from what we saw the people doing on the Capitol, because both are motivated by the belief that we are supposed to be protected by the law, but not bound by the law. And that other people, people of color primarily, or police who sort of go into white supremacy, even if they're Black, by becoming police, but that people of color are supposed to be bound by the law, but not protected by the law. And so in this dynamic of protests, we see that exactly. We don't have police there trying to protect the protesters. We have police there trying to bind and punish the protesters. In the protests, the insurrection that we saw Wednesday, we see the police acting by the same logic, the people acting by the same logic that police act by, that they are talking about the Second Amendment at the moment they're trying to overthrow the Constitution. They believe so thoroughly that they're there to be protected. And you see it in any type of legal proceedings that go against police officers as well. They only look at the way that they're supposed to enforce the law on others and be protected by the law. We see it most clearly in the double standard created by Maryland's Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. And so that brings us in, like, plainclothes policing is fundamentally, like Brandon was saying, a war against people of color in this city, and especially what's considered by the police department as sort of superfluous populations, unemployed people in East and West Baltimore, where they go through at all hours of the day, at all times, and enforce laws that don't even exist. If you're walking to the store, you'll be stopped, you'll be searched, you'll be detained illegally. And we as the community, and especially as white people in the community, used to allow that to be justified by the war on drugs. Oh, okay, we can't let crack get out there, we have to stop this. Now that we have changed our feelings about drugs, we allow guns to justify it. But it's the same rhetoric, war on guns instead of war on drugs, same behavior, stop anyone because they might have a gun and justify it by the fact of having a gun. And so what they've essentially done is make illegal entire populations by doing this, that wages war on them. And then, as Brandon pointed out, the cops, that this grows on them over time, where they don't see them as people, and they don't get the rewards as for turning in drugs. So it sets up this dynamic where, as I'm violating people's rights, hoping to get a gun, I might as well just steal the drugs and profit off of those as well.
So, picking up on that, what this says to me is that the GTTF thrive for the amount of time that they thrive because they consider their victims to be disposable. And perhaps even more important, they knew that the BPD considered them to be disposable, and hyper-policing thrives on those who are seen as disposable. And Baynard, to that point, the insurgents at the Capitol were not disposable, right? They were actually protected. As one commentator actually said on television, they really had no fear of law enforcement because nothing told them that they should be fearful, right? On the other hand, Black people are scared of police because everything has told them that they have to be scared. And along these lines, and again, Baynard, picking up on your point about walking to the store, policing is also very much about space, right? Who is allowed or entitled to occupy space? And so the Department of Justice, who investigated the BPD in the aftermath of Freddie Gray's death, right? They concluded in a nutshell that the BPD has long abused the constitutional rights and bodies of Baltimore's Black residents. And their investigative report recounts several instances where the BPD officers ordered residents of Baltimore to move off the streets where they lived, right? To move away from their own homes, right? And to the BPD, these residents actually trespassed and loitered where they lived. And what that says is that there was no space that was theirs. There was no space that they owned. The BPD believed that these particular streets, these particular homes, these particular communities belonged to them. In contrast, the insurgents believed that the Capitol was theirs for that amount of time, right? There was a sense of freedom. And the insufficient law enforcement presence did not disabuse them of this sense while they were inside the Capitol, while they lingered in front of the Capitol after they exited, while they walked back to their hotels or wherever else where they were staying, and while they traveled back to their home states. And so I do want to get back to this investigative report in this context. You actually write in your book that the DOJ report, again, that made these findings against the BPD, quote, reads almost like a resume of GTTF activities, unquote. However, there's nothing about the GTTF in the report. So explain the connection, or really the disconnection, between the DOJ investigators who were in Baltimore and the GTTF.
So I want to talk about space real quick, because that's really
Please.
something maybe I should have said earlier when you asked me about the general of the GTTF. Important thing about the GTTF is they were didn't have a limited jurisdiction because they were framed as investigative, because in theory, what they were doing was investigating people who were, again, sort of dealing guns the way we see drugs dealt. They were able to travel around the whole city. And in fact, the Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, the sort of mastermind here, understood that the lack of jurisdiction is what would be really great for his criminal enterprise. So you sort of think that if you really take the leash off of plainclothes police officers, if you really take the leash off of these kind of investigators and you give them the whole city, then they might start, it makes it much easier to do these sort of complicated, crimes where they're investigating someone, they're going from one part of the town to take them to the other, that kind of thing. So that's kind of important there. And then related to that, I mean, yeah, and then the Capitol is like also like the Capitol, the view of these fascists that, were in the Capitol last week is that the Capitol is ours and it's been taken from them. And you also see this in terms of how police officers who generally don't live in the city, in the same way that these fascists that came to DC don't live in DC, see the city as something they need to take back, even though, police officers are living in the county or they're living in Shrewsbury, Pennsylvania or whatever. And so that's kind of another way that those are parallel. I think that's kind of an important part of it. Maybe, Banner, you want to pick up from there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the crazy things to note is, so the DOJ, the Civil Rights Division, got an office in BPD headquarters, and it shared a wall with the GTTF.
And this part is one of the most chilling parts of the book for me, but please explain.
They had they were literally next door, and so they were even able to use that to further their criminal enterprises. Jenkins had a white bail bondsman from the county who was his fence for stolen drugs, and they allowed that allowed him, this bail bondsman, to come into the office more freely, to go into evidence control. They stole evidence from evidence control, some pot at one point that had been picked up at a FedEx thing, because everyone assumed that the bald white guy was a DOJ guy walking through there. And so the DOJ actually helped to give them cover in what they were doing while they were doing the investigation on the Baltimore Police Department. And then far from having any kind of impact, the day the report came out, they went and allegedly planted 2 different guns on 2 different people. One just right around the corner from my house. And then the next one was the first case that was settled. The plaintiff in the case was murdered while the case was going through, but his was the first case to be settled to get with the city against GTTF. And they planted a gun on him the night that that DOJ report came out. And so the idea that this report did anything to curb Baltimore police officers, or that it, that it didn't even further what they were doing. And that brings us in that we should really be, this isn't a story about how the FBI swooped in and saved the day. At the end, the FBI and the DEA really just stumbled on it because they were doing the thing that they always do. They were investigating people, black people that they thought were selling drugs to white people. And one of those people called one of the detectives. They got a wire in the detective's phone. And so they were going after a drug bust. And the reason that the prosecutor was so interested in getting on the case is he wanted to be able to bring murder charges against people that sold heroin to someone that caused an overdose. And he wanted to test that theory and be able to test that kind of case. So, it was important for us to make defense attorneys really be in that investigative role that normally is law enforcement in a book like this, in a sort of thriller, because they were the ones who for years and years and years had been calling out, hey, my client, they broke into my client's house. They did all of these things to my client, and no one else up the chain was paying attention.
Mm-hmm. And so, much of this is about accountability, and aside from the system and the institution, right? But much of this is about accountability and fitness to actually serve as an officer. And you explain in your book that one of the GTTF officers actually cannot testify in any criminal proceeding because he had been deemed to be not credible. He was actually on a sort of no-call list because he actually lied in court in a previous proceeding. We talked about how former Sergeant Jenkins, who was the ringleader, as you said, previously, I believe it was in 2003, that there was an internal affairs investigation of him that found that he had committed misconduct and neglected his duties, and essentially got off with a warning. And Brandon, as you point out, there were scores of police officers who participated in the insurgency last week, whether they were outside or inside the Capitol. And we now see the FBI, as you said, reaching out to law enforcement departments to identify officers, and we'll see what happens. And to your point, I certainly agree wholeheartedly with you that there certainly is a white supremacy problem in policing. Many people have been talking about that, writing about that for many, many years. And so there are these questions of who is fit to serve, who should have the privilege of serving. Okay. Another thing in terms of a parallel between your book and last week that sticks out for me is this whole notion of voice, right? You write that everyone knew about these officers, right? But yet nothing was done. Say the state's attorney's office knew about the officers, other officers knew about the officers. You have sort of a riveting passage in the book about how one of the heads of the public defender's office, looking back, how much it made her sick that they had heard from many clients over the years about how these officers planted this evidence on them and they were lying about them. But this whole notion that, from her perspective, lots of clients denied the charges, right? But then you also talk about Dee Watkins, who's a resident, a native of East Baltimore, very prolific author. And you talk about how he, I believe, sort of put you on to Detective Herschel and Detective Herschel's activities in East Baltimore. And Dee Watkins, in his most recent book, talks about Detective Herschel, about him slapping the food out of, their hand, out of their, out of just random people on Broadway and East Baltimore. So there's another really sort of troubling parallel here. And you mentioned this, Brandon, that, Black residents have screamed for years and decades in Baltimore about police abuse. They were not heard, they were not believed. And then we have all these threats that preceded last week's insurrection, but the authorities did not believe, or at least did not believe, the scale of the threats. And so the notion of sort of Black victims of police abuse not being believed, and sort of threatened white violence, right, not being believed. And I just, wonder if you had any thoughts about sort of that sort of, dichotomy, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that will be really interesting to see from a legal perspective, this case was a conspiracy case against all of these officers. And so it was able to, not every individual had to be involved in every action, but it was their ongoing conspiracy, and they were furthering their conspiracy, which was then, interestingly, the city's argument against paying out on the settlements that, well, they were actually furthering their conspiracy rather than police. Their police job, which they were doing both at the same time. But it's one of the few cases where we will actively charge right-wingers with conspiracy. During the president's inauguration, I was covering that, and there were 200 people kettled, arrested, all charged with almost identical charges, and all charged with conspiracy. Someone who was talking about the protest on a podcast was charged with conspiracy. Any live streamer was charged with conspiracy for furthering the conspiracy. I don't think any of that will happen with the prosecutions of the right wingers, because we tend to see conspiracy since 1919 as this left wing thing rather than as a right wing thing, and it keeps us from being able to see it. And that really relates to, I mean, the federal prosecutor in the case said they did this because they thought that their victims were beneath the law. They're precisely the people that no one would listen to. And there's this sense that they can conspire against them because they're the ones who are holding all of the power. So if everyone with power says you had drugs on you, or says that, and they steal, they arrest you with 7 kilos, but you actually had 10, it's also your lawyer's not going to be able to say, well, Your Honor, he actually had 10 kilos, and we want to get into, because that's not what you're supposed to be doing as a defense attorney. And so their conspiracy was perfectly poised not to be recognized because of the prejudices of our system and because of the amount of power that they held. And it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in the cases against the insurrectionists this week.
So I want to switch gears a bit, just to ask about your ability to get the deep stories that you lay out in the book, particularly from the victims of the GTTF. How did you earn their trust for them to be able to give you so much of their lives and so much of their suffering? And I ask because, it's one thing to read about the horrors of criminal policing, but certainly it's another to talk to the victims themselves. And my second question is, what impact did hearing their firsthand accounts have on you?
Maybe I'll go and then you can pick up, Boehner, if we should both comment on this. So, I mean, certainly something that helped us a little bit is that we had been doing something like this kind of reporting for quite a few years at the Baltimore City paper, and then briefly at the Baltimore Beat when that newspaper existed after the City paper's death. And so we had a little bit of a sort of entryway into, because certain people sort of knew who we were. We could say, hey, we've been writing about Hersl for years. So that helped us a little bit. And then it was mostly just approaching people from, I think, a perspective that is in my opinion, the rightest perspective that also aligns with my values, which is I was sort of interested in what happened to these people and how it affected them. I wasn't particularly interested in whether or not they had, quote unquote, done something illegal, especially in a city where the underground economy essentially is one of the economies because of the industrialization and neoliberal politics that take over the city. We've created this underground economy that's central to the city. And so the idea of like sort of criticizing or going after these people and be like, but you were a drug dealer, just didn't make any sense to me. So, I mean, so that was kind of our start, was like earning trust by saying what we're interested. This is what we're interested in. And I think to some extent, coming at it and trying to understand where these people were coming from and giving them a lot of time to speak and comment on it. and really being mindful of that and showing them that we weren't interested in talking to them for 15 minutes just to hear the great details and stick it in a story. I mean, one thing you can kind of read in the book is clearly there was a lot of work to sort of build this book into scenes. It doesn't read like sort of conventional journalism. It feels like you're reading something closer to maybe a piece of fiction, although it's all true, to be clear, or, you know, maybe something like a movie script. So we would really have to spend a lot of time with people and earn their trust in that way. And I think just showing that we were interested in sticking around really meant a lot to people, because the story of reporting is that, and it really reflects policing, by the way. Policing and reporting are fundamentally inextricably tied, and they support each other in a lot of ways, especially like sort of conventional corporate journalism is generally some white dude whose beat is homicide or beat is crime, whatever that means. Of course, by crime, we mean black, lower working class and underground economy is crime. We don't think of crime as what's happening in the mayor's office or whatever. But generally the way reporting works is a white reporter goes to West Baltimore, East Baltimore, who doesn't live and doesn't spend that much time, says, hey, I heard about this thing. Give me all your information. Thanks. All right, I'm out of here. And they run a story the next day. We didn't want to do that. That's not what we do. I don't ever want to do that. So I think showing that we wanted to return and give people time, and that time thing is important too. There's people that were in this book that we wrote a letter to, you know, a year before they got back to us. And that seemed like just like a lark, but it was also kind of just like, want to be mindful, not just like going up to someone's door and be like, tell me about all your trauma right now. Thank you. But kind of giving them the time. And so that patience, which you can only really do with a book, although we wrote this pretty quick, was a big part of that. So that's kind of the big picture stuff, is like really being attentive and mindful of people's time and energy and really respectful of it. And asking for details and asking how they felt. In terms of how it made me feel, it was just devastating. I mean, people ask in one level why maybe the book isn't full of Baynard and I kind of running our mouths about policing the way maybe we're doing a little today. But that's because for me at least, I know we talked about this, Baynard and I did, was like, once you start to hear these people's stories and they really give you the time and energy, you really want to respect and take the time with that. And then your sort of own more big picture values about that just don't seem as important. Like, it kind of ends up feeling like you're using people if you sort of construct this entire book to sort of say what you already thought before you started it. But it also, as Baynard sort of said, the war on guns is one example that was really challenging. It was like, that's not something that either of us had thought of in the way that, oh, wait, we're using guns the way we use drugs, and that's really fraught because we're disproportionately policing people of color who may or may not have guns. So it really was just like eye-opening, even as someone who's fairly cynical about police and has friends who have been really damaged by the police. I was still just like completely floored by people's ability to tell these stories, what happened to them, and also the ability to kind of pick up and keep going after that.
I appreciate that. So I'm just going to ask, because I do want to get to questions. No, that's fine. No, it's fine. I just want to pivot. What lessons does the GTF's corruption offer for policing in Baltimore moving forward? And you wrote an article in the Washington Post last year, and it's in the chat. So if you go to the top of the chat, it's the second article that's highlighted. But the article you both talk about the resistance of police officers to reform and the power that unions have to resist those reforms as well. So just wondering, what are you thinking about the process and the possibilities of moving forward, if you will?
I mean, what Brandon said earlier about GTTF functioning as a counterinsurgency after the uprising here, I think is really useful for the police, accountability. People in the police department needs to really address that and deal with that the people within the department actively thwarted every kind of reform that was possible. In the sort of menu of Obama era reforms, they thwarted all of those. They used body camera footage, or even before there were body cameras, they used phone footage to, in one case, the most sort of notorious, they broke into a guy's safe. They stole over $100,000 out of the safe. They sealed the safe back up, and then they videotaped themselves cracking it open again. And they turn that in as evidence of the case. They similarly, when they would break into people's houses, they would film conversations with them in order to give themselves reasons to go into the house and fabricate things on that. And in one case that's recently coming up, they broke a guy's jaw, and then they said, we're going to let you go if you videotape that you fell and you did this on your own, and because they never found anything on him. And so realizing that the individual squads and officers are looking out for themselves. I mean, one of the things that the big lessons that we've gotten is, and you could see it in the presidential election, we thought that Joe Biden fundamentally misunderstood police as public servants. And the thing that Trump understood about police and that we saw the other day is that they are a special interest group that are protecting and serving themselves. And that's their primary motivation, is gaining power for police, and you see it if you follow any of the police people on Twitter or anything else. If you look at the way the FOP responds to by the way, they have not mentioned the Capitol police officer who was killed, even insulted an officer over the summer, they'd be tweeting it out immediately. And how dare people talk mean to us? And if you're mean to police, that will make homicide rise. And that's the other thing, is that homicide does not increase because people criticize police officers. That they've convinced a vast majority of news people and people in general to believe that is just completely insane. If anything that we've seen over the course of the nation with rising murders and stuff over this year. And it would have a lot more to do with underground economies being disrupted because of COVID and stuff, and nothing to do with people criticizing police. But they've convinced us all to believe that, and they leverage violence at every instance over first the scared politicians who in a city like this know that the top line end of the year murder rate is the thing that's going to sink them or let them float. And then all of us that, oh my God, well, we can't let people be killed, and so we need to give the police all the power we can give them.
One thing I'd throw in really quick would be that one other way this all ties together that I thought about quite a bit was, I think I assume most of us are aware of the death of Sean Suter, the police officer who was found shot in the head a day before he was supposed to testify against these officers in a grand jury. Whether you think that was a suicide or a homicide, we can sort of put to the side. But like what you clearly saw with that, similar to the officer killed last week, is that when it is not politically advantageous to politicize and exploit these abuses or harm against police, they will not. They really give away the game when you suddenly realize they're not mourning a police officer. And so it was not, to really have dug into the Suter thing for the police would have been, for a long term, would have really had to reckon with this corruption. I think you're seeing the same thing. Like, it's more convenient to sort of sacrifice this one officer, who I admit, I can't remember his name just because I'm not seeing it on Twitter the way you usually see officers who are harmed like that. And so it's another way that these parallel is like, that's the political side of it. Is like, they can't politicize this death without sort of giving away the larger fascist game. And so they're just kind of going to pretend like this one officer's death in the Capitol last week is not that big of a deal all of a sudden.
So I want to get to some of the questions, but I will say this just to sum up. And, we see that there are, commissions and bodies that are, looking into the GTTF and the BPD and how is it that the GTF was allowed to thrive. There really can be no healing in Baltimore without full accountability and from the top down. And similarly, we've seen some calls for quote unquote moving on that have been made in a few days following the insurrection, which, really are, those calls are, to me, offensive. There is no moving on, and there's a difference between healing and moving on. And so, any calls for healing, with regards to last week, also cannot be answered until there is full accountability in the broader sense and in the deepest sense. Okay. So there have been some questions and comments in the chat, and some of them look like they've been answered by Brandon, but I do want to raise them just for everyone. So there's one question about, is there a new plainclothes squad in Baltimore since the GTTF?
Yeah, so they said for a very brief minute after after they disbanded GTTF, and they said they're going to disband plainclothes, but they weren't disbanding plainclothes units at all. What they were doing was making them wear uniforms. And we've seen this so many times that they want the name, the crimes to get attached to GTTF rather than BPD. And so they will switch, but there are, anytime you hear them say proactive policing, it means the same thing as these plainclothes squads. And what they are is they're officers who don't respond to calls. If you call 911 and have an emergency, they're not the ones who come out. If you have someone who's murdered and there's a homicide detectives come in and investigate that, they're not the ones who do that either. They're the ones who drive around looking for trouble, being proactive, which means waging war on the citizens. And so, yeah, there's just as many plainclothes units operating in the city as there were before GTTF.
Okay. And then there's a question as well as a comment. That don't the horrific events from last week demonstrate the importance of local gun control measures? And in DC, it's actually DC. You can't just openly carry firearms. It's not an open carry jurisdiction. Any weapon you carry has to be concealed. You actually have to have a license for it. You can't carry an assault weapon. And so it's actually, an interesting point as well, a very sobering point. That is, if DC were an open carry jurisdiction such as Michigan, just imagine what could have happened and what probably would have happened, right? And so that's more of a comment about the importance of local gun measures and sort of how, despite everything that happened, things could have been actually a whole lot worse, right? Brandon.
Well, let me step in. I apologize.
Go ahead.
We got to make it clear. There is a huge difference between allowing people to open carry and having police officers driving around specifically black. I know we all understand this. So I want to make it really clear.
Make it clear.
There's a massive difference between open carry. Like I've been in open carry states. I covered the Republican National Convention. People with automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons, I should say, walking around is massively different than police officers trolling around specifically black neighborhoods. Yeah. And so I think, is it true that if this was in say Cleveland, we would have had a bloodbath? Absolutely. But the sort of thing I just want to sort of tie off is this idea that like what you're seeing is that on the daily, these gun control measures, which are framed not as gun control, by the way, always as like sort of going after bad guys, are very specifically aimed at incarcerating young black men who, because of the failings of the state, feel like they have to have guns. So I hear what you're saying, and I think it's if you're a big 2A kind of guy, it's going to be really hard to reconcile what did and didn't happen in DC. But the sort of minutia of gun control in terms of handguns and things like that, which if you really wanted to stop violence in the country, you would ban handguns before you ban AR-15s. But it's sort of a complicated thing. I want to acknowledge that, but just like you don't have cops driving around the suburbs of Pennsylvania looking for guys with AR-15s.
Well taken. So another question is, and as you wrote about in the book, this notion of documenting police lawlessness. What do you see as the role of lawyers in the legal profession? And actually, you actually dedicate your book to defense attorneys protecting the Fourth Amendment. So in that context, that's the question. Like, what do you see the role of lawyers in the legal profession in terms of documenting police lawlessness?
Yeah, and I mean, that question comes from Doug, who I've known for a long time and actually helped me to come to understand some of this back when I was covering the trials of the officers in the Freddie Gray case for The Guardian. He was someone that helped me understand things like Wardlow and Terry stops and issues that then became central to our understanding for this book. And I mean, it also goes to the question about how did we find the victims and talk to the victims and earn trust. First was earning trust with their lawyers and having ongoing and long-term relationships where you can talk to people and ask them to help you understand and not act like you know things, and then listen when they're explaining what their clients are going through. And as the question points out, it's a bind though, because you can't, I mean, on some of the video that we've seen, we have lawyers, we have Ivan Bates saying, Your Honor, we have on video on their own body camera that they walked into my client's house illegally, and everyone on up just dismisses these cases. And so one thing you can do as lawyers is make friends with people in the press and make sure that your client's stories get out there. The only single source stories allowed in a major newspaper in this country are real estate. Oh, this developer's building this great new thing. And of course, it's not going to ever happen. And it's not a great new thing. And 2, police reporting. Oh, police say that this person had a gun on them. And so everything we did was justified. And the problem is when we don't get the other side's perspective. And so really making an effort to reach out to the lawyers and not just doing it like Brandon sort of mentioned as a daily reporter, call up once, wasn't available for comment, and never call again. Sometimes it takes a year of going back around and then that person will be ready to finally talk. And so I think that, we've really become, I've become very much a Fourth Amendment absolutist in the course of doing this. And I think that defense attorneys are the only people. There have been other organizations standing up for the First Amendment, for the Second Amendment, but y'all are the only ones who have been standing up for the Fourth on a daily basis and really saying you cannot enter someone's home without having a really strong rationale for that. And I think you could then be on the front line of sort of lobbying against things like no-knock warrants, like we saw with Breonna Taylor, this summer, which also ties in with the real estate stuff, that it turns out it was Gentrification Squad sort of pushing the call to go forward. And so make friends with reporters, please get in touch with us, but also push every day for those. I mean, Deb Levy in the public defender's office, you see the way that the prosecutors just despise her, and the judges sometimes too, because she will not let it go on Fourth Amendment issues with her clients. And I'd love to see a lot more of that happening in courts.
And I would maybe just throw in the book kind of shows which is similar to reporting too, I think, with defense attorneys. You have Ivan Bates, who's a main character who had dozens of cases involving these officers and sort of knew and was putting the pieces together. There is a really kind of, it's a complicated thing to be pushing against all this for years and years. And sometimes the rewards for doing it can feel a little shallow, or, you've been yelling about Wayne Jenkins since 2009 and in 2017, he finally gets indicted. But that kind of push, it shows. I mean, I don't know how validating that is, but we're watching cases to write this book from 6 years ago and start to see attorneys really yelling about this already. That's that day-to-day work that doesn't always reward. Sometimes that client ends up in jail, unfortunately, and they shouldn't be. But that kind of day-to-day grind is, I really admire and appreciate that, and seeing defense attorneys who can do that day-to-day grind and also maintain this big picture concern for it is really powerful. And I guess in a way it's similar to reporting. You just put your head down and keep doing it.
So we also have a question, because we do have folks on the Zoom who may be prosecutors, right? After they graduate from law school and want to be and prosecutors. And so the question is, this is a great question. How should the potential prosecutors on the Zoom handle their future relationships with police officers? Based on, your research and based on your journalism, what do you have to offer in that regard about what is it prosecutors should be doing about how they should handle their relationships with police officers?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And we thought a lot about it. And one of the people whose lives was really destroyed by this in a less way than the people who were incarcerated and stuff. But Anna Mantegna, a prosecutor who ended up being fired by the state's attorney's office as the leak to them. And we didn't really think that it was possible that what they said happened. And so we looked a lot into it, but what we saw in watching at the court reporter's office, watching trial after trial, is how prosecutors were willing to overlook any kind of misconduct in order to get the win. And I see that they see that their mission is, this person did something, we need to get them off the street. But there's the, like you mentioned with Rayam not being able to testify. It's like, okay, well, we'll just get Hersl to testify. And I don't know of any problems against him. And it's hard to believe that people didn't know. He was the subject of numerous news stories and stuff, that Hersl had any problems with credibility. And so just because someone's on your side doesn't mean that they're telling the truth. And I mean, one of the great cases that almost brought Jenkins down, prosecutor Molly Webb got word from the defense attorney. He gave her video that showed that what the statement of probable cause said was entirely false. She pushed that. She not only refused to prosecute the case, but filed an IAD complaint, pushed that up the line. As it turned out, the state's attorney's office fired her and let Jenkins keep going on with doing what he was going to be doing. But it really is the thing that people say, but don't necessarily do. It really is about getting justice rather than victory.
So one last question. What lessons do you want law students to take away from your book? Or what do you want them to get out of your book?
I'm thinking, I apologize.
That's all right.
I think for me, a big thing is that like how important it is that you really are the first line of defense against police overreach, against police misconduct, and therefore against this sort of fascist creep that we see coming in at a larger level. Like y'all, as well as maybe us in the press, but are the line, and this goes for prosecutors as well, because you have the ability to stop something from going forward, even when a defense attorney doesn't. That y'all are the defense of the Constitution, and especially of the Fourth Amendment, which protects our own individual bodies and liberty. And so, you know, there's that sort of that view in popular culture and stuff of the slimy defense lawyer and but we see it often as something really heroic of especially in public defenders' offices, of you are the one who can really save people's lives from being sucked into this machine where they lose all control of their lives and their destiny.
And part of that, I believe, it was just reading your book as well, for law students, is really getting to know communities in Baltimore and getting to know, you know, everyone who makes this city such a great city, right? Because there's these different narratives, and really to get to the truth, you have to listen and you have to absorb these different narratives. I'm actually putting back into the chat the links we had at the beginning, so that's why you see me going back and forth with this other with my other screen. So first of all, and it's almost 1 o'clock. So thank you both for taking the time out to speak with us today about your book, and again, how you see your book situated within their insurrection from last week. And certainly to the law school community, we'll be having more conversations, right, about these events. And obviously there are lots of questions to explore, such as, you know, broader questions about impeachment and the 25th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, Section 3, about voter suppression, et cetera. So this was just, you know, a lead-in, right, to these broader conversations, but also we think it's really, really important that as we talk about policing, we also connect it to, you know, events outside of Baltimore, certainly what we saw, you know, last week. All right, so thank you both again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. It's great to talk to y'all.
Just a word to say thank you very much as well. Thanks very much to Baynard and Brandon.
And I'm putting in the very last link right here. I thought I did it. I'm bad with this stuff, so I probably messed it up. But here they are again, because this is important reading for everybody. So I want everybody to be exposed to Brandon and Baynard's wonderful work. Okay. Here we go.
Thanks so much, y'all.
Okay.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Michael.